welcome to the first OARC events talk, and I'm very delighted to say that we have a full program of these planned for throughout the year. Hopefully, fingers crossed. The first talk this evening, though, is on a topic which I know some people will be very interested in, and which some people may say is niche, but which I'm sure Jonathan will be about to tell us is very accessible and doable. And he's going to let us know how it all works and how we can get started. So I'd like to hand over to Jonathan Naylor, G4KLX, everybody.
Yeah, hello, greetings. My name is Jonathan Naylor, G4KLX. Been licensed since 1980 as a G4 and as a Class B since 1979. Since that time, I've done most aspects of the hobby, actually including EME, but that was many years ago. But this is a general overview of EME. There will be mention of my equipment, but for the most part, it's going to be a very generic talk. And if people have got questions, you can ask at the end. And of course, I'm on OARC every day pretty well, so you can always ask me somewhere on the Discord. Okay, so let's talk about what is Moonbounce. First of all, you need to remember that the term EME and Moonbounce are exactly equivalent, and I'll probably be using both myself during the talk. There's no difference. EME is just a bit easier to say, that's all. So what is it? Well, as you know, we can all see the moon. In fact, the moon is particularly beautiful tonight. It's clear sky here. It's gorgeous. And at any given time, the moon is visible from half of the world. Whether you're covered or not is another question, but at any given time, the moon covers half of the world. And so what you can do is you can bounce signals off it and talk to other people who can see the moon at that time. The downside is, as it says there, is that the path length is 750,000 kilometers. Now, normally when you work, say, Australia on 20 meters, we're talking of a path length of what, 18,000 kilometers maybe, or is it less? I can't remember. But this is 750,000. Plus or minus, the moon does vary a little. And that comes down to a 2.4-second delay on transmissions. It's actually hearable. If you can hear your own echoes, you can actually hear the tail end of your own transmission. As it says, it's been done on all bands from 50 megahertz to 47 gigahertz. As you can gather, the higher bands, particularly 24 and 47 gigahertz, are what you would call experimental, to say the least. But on the lower bands, it's a fact. People just do it, and it's not regarded as being particularly outrageous. EME has been done on 4 meters by GD0TEP, who were at ZS back in 2008, I think it was, 2007. I looked it up yesterday. How he did it within the UK license regulations, I'm not sure, but we'll let that pass. But it has been done. But it's obviously easier on a band with a more reasonable power outputs. Moonbounce, I'm not going to say it's too simple. It is challenging. You need to put together quite a good system. And unlike HF, where you sort of say, well, it's only 3 dBs, it doesn't make a big difference at the far end. On Moonbounce, 3 dBs makes a big difference. It can make the difference between a QSO and no QSO. Some of the weaker signals, and bear in mind the signals can be very weak indeed. An extra dB can make a difference, and it can be very frustrating when the signal isn't quite strong enough. You can see them, and perhaps they can't see you, or you only see one transmission in 10 from them or something. It's just on the edge. An extra dB would make that a doable QSO. The upside of EME is that, unlike propagation on the HF bands, or VHF for that matter, the moon is predictable. It's possible to do predictions of the moon for literally centuries in the future, which means that the position of the moon is always known, even if it isn't very good for yourself. And so you've got guaranteed access to the moon for a few weeks every month. And of course, when the moon isn't accessible for various reasons, you can use that downtime to actually work on your equipment, replace it, clean it up, or just generally watch television or something. As you gather, when the distance is 750,000 kilometers, it's also a case of how do you measure a QSO? You can obviously count countries, and people do. DXCC has been worked on many EME bands. But in terms of distance, even if I work somebody 10 miles away, in reality, it's still a 750,000 kilometer round trip. So you don't really measure distance. It's meaningless. So what you do tend to collect, if you collect anything, is initials, literally the number of people you've worked off the moon, because almost every QSO on EME counts as an achievement for somebody. Maybe not yourself, because your equipment might be working well, but for that other person, it could be a big achievement and be one of the happiest days of their lives. So what do you need? What equipment do you need? In general, you need a radio capable of SSB and CW operation. FM won't cut it. The radio has to have good frequency stability. Bear in mind the transmission periods can be a minute or more. So within that period, it can't drift very far, only a few hertz maximum. And accuracy is also essential, particularly, for example, if you're doing EME CW, which I have done a little, people often use 30 hertz filters. You need to, in order to get the signal out of the noise. And obviously, you've got to be on the right frequency, bearing in mind there's also Doppler shift, of course, and you've got to be in the right place. So a radio has typically got to be either GPS stabilized or a very, very good oscillator. Either is acceptable, but you must have a radio that's pretty decent. Now, that's true of most modern radios, by the way, although some radios do need a little bit of help. You will need a very low noise preamplifier, as close to the antenna as possible, because any loss in front of the preamplifier adds directly to the noise. You will probably need a power amplifier, depending on what your radio is capable of course. A suitable antenna, goes without saying. Suitable software. As you can gather, or as you'll see in later ones, the standard software for transmission reception is WSJTX. And in fact, I'll come back to that later. That's the one that's being used. You also need something to control the antenna position. I mean, you could do it manually, but bearing in mind, if you've got a big antenna, the moon is probably moving a couple of times a minute at the very least. And if you're not careful, you could end up overloading yourself in the same way that working low Earth orbit satellites can require a lot of effort, both in terms of Doppler shift and moving the antenna. So if you can have any help in moving the antenna piece of software, that's going to be great. And it's also very nice, although not essential, to have access to EME chat pages. There aren't many contests off the moon. Most of the time, people are just working each other and helping each other, I might add. It's not very competitive. It's all down to helping each other. So access to the EME chat pages is not essential, although to be fair, if you have a very small station, it can be very advantageous. It's also nice to be able to know what's happening, who's about to become active. And of course, if the moon's not up, you just chat about technical things. So what modes do you use? Well, WSJT is the standard. And in fact, it was originally created in, I think, about 2001. It was created for EME. There was no FT8 in those days. That came much later. And they created a mode called JT44, or Joe Taylor did, sorry. That's why it's JT, of course. And that became a sensation. I mean, I wasn't active myself, but I was certainly aware of it because I used to read the newsletters. And of course, like FT8, it caused a lot of discussion, shall we say, between, is it valid radio? I think that that question has passed by now. Eventually, JT44 was supplanted by JT65, which added another layer of power based on forward error correction. And that worked very well indeed. Over time, they realized that JT65 as a single mode didn't make a lot of sense, especially on the higher frequencies because of things like frequency spreading and things like that. And they created submodes like JT65A, JT65B, all with slightly different parameters suited for different bands. And eventually, for whatever reason, I wasn't party to the decision or anything, they brought out a new mode called Q65. And yet again, it's better than JT65. It has a lot of submodes. JT's, and not only submodes, but it also has different times as well. So the fastest mode is 15-second overs. The longest is 5-minute overs. I've never used one of those. I think my amplifier would have blown up a bit quicker if I had. It's very common to have 1-minute overs though. And so they got Q65 modes, which work extraordinarily well, down to signals of almost minus 30 decibels in a 3 kilohertz bandwidth, which is extraordinary. CW on EME is definitely used. I've worked, I think, 7 stations on it. I can't say I particularly enjoy it. I'm good at CW. I can regularly do morsel at 40 words a minute, but I just don't find I'm quite as good at picking out weak signals anymore. It's obviously age or something. And so although I've done CWEME, I don't enjoy it, and I much prefer the digital modes. But it is still there, and there are people who think it's the only mode that's worthwhile. And a working knowledge of CW is still useful, even if it's only to pick up one or two people. So let's have a look at an EME system. In fact, this equation is actually a general systems analysis equation. So what you do, you start off with transmit power. This is all expressed in decibels. We're not doing calculations. I'm just going to show how it works. You start off with your power in decibels, probably dBm. You take away your feeder loss. You add your transmit antenna gain. You take away the path loss, whatever the path is. You then add your receive antenna gain. You remove feeder loss. You add your receiver sensitivity. You put that into a big mix, and what do you get? You get the received signal. As you appreciate, there are variables in there. You can't do anything about the path loss. That's fixed, but you can do something about the rest of it. So for example, the negative terms are feeder loss. So if you can reduce your feeder loss on transmit or receive, you will improve your receive signal. The same goes for your antenna. If you increase your antenna, or the other station increases their antenna, you've improved the equation. It means the received signal is improved. The same goes for transmit power. If you double your transmit power, your signal is 3 dB stronger without any other changes in this equation. So that's the way to think about it. So when you see some of the antennas later, you'll appreciate that although there's, for example, the transmit antenna gain might be very low, the other person, the person they're working might have a very good antenna and a very good receiver sensitivity, and it makes up for your, for example, lack of power or lack of antenna gain or high feeder loss. It's all balanced. So if somebody's got a very, very good system with a very large antenna and a good receiver, you can start to use less transmit power and less antenna gain. And they say will become important later on. Okay, so what happens? This is a screenshot of my first EME QSO, November the 10th, 2024. And as you can gather, I was so excited I didn't actually do a proper screenshot. I just photographed it with my phone, but I was very excited. And that's what happens. That's what WSJT looks like in Q65 mode. And as you can gather, it looks just like FT8. The only difference is that a few of the entries say Q65, I think it was 60C was the mode, which meant it was 60-second overs. C is to do with the frequency spacing. And as you can see, I'd worked G0LBK in J003 Dave, straightforward, bang, 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 Roger, Roger, 73s. Then I worked Howard G4CCH, also in Lincolnshire. My first two EME QSOs. What a day that was! But that's how it is. That's how it looks. Obviously, at the same time, what you don't hear, of course, is the big fans running to keep the amplifier cool and me probably screaming in happiness at the same time. But that's what it looks like. Okay, so what can you work? Now, this is based on my personal experience. So this is 23 centimeters EME, which, to be fair, is very busy. Most activity is in Europe. This is a fact. And despite the size of the USA and the number of people who are licensed there, the number of stations active in the USA, comparatively speaking, is very, very poor. I'll be showing maps in a moment. You can see the difference in density, shall we say, between the two continents. The rest of the world is even less well represented, it must be said, and it's quite common to have nobody operating in a given country. For example, on 23 centimeters, there is only one station active in China. I've worked in, that's great, I'm very happy about that. Japan, I don't know how many amateurs there are. I think there's only 2 or 3 active. I've worked them all. Yet you get a country like, I'm not sure if it's Uruguay or Paraguay, I can never remember. There's 3 active stations. But Brazil, which is a much bigger country, has 1. There is no rhyme or reason. As it says there, the most active countries in Europe are the Netherlands, Germany, and the Czech Republic. That's not in any order, by the way. Although I would say, I've spelled Netherlands wrong, haven't I? Sorry, if you're from the Netherlands, it wasn't intentional. But they are the most active countries by far. And if you want to locate the busiest, or in EME terms, the busiest place in Europe, JO21, which is the square, which has bits of Belgium and bits of Holland in, sorry, the Netherlands, that is the most active place. It must be hellishly QRME there. Let's have a look at a map. These are QSOs I've had. The red means they're unconfirmed, green means they're confirmed. This is cloud log. forgetting who's confirmed and who's not confirmed, you can see that Western Europe, in the general sense, or in fact in Europe, is pretty well represented. Germany, Belgium, Holland, UK, not so much. Each one of those squares, for the most part, has only got one person in the UK. In, for example, Portugal, there are 3 stations active. In Spain, 1. I don't understand that how it works. If you look at the Czech Republic, very, very well covered. Same goes for Northern Italy. Quite a lot of Russian stations active. As you can see, it's busy. It can be very, very busy, in fact. If we look at North America in comparison, there's on 23 centimeters EME, there is 1 station in Canada, 1 station in Mexico. There's probably about 5 or 6 in California, and there's quite a few in the Northeast as well. That's where Joe Taylor K1JT is based, and I think there's something to do with it. And also Al Katz, K2UYH, who went Silent Key last year. But in between, there's not a lot of activity. Yeah, there's much less American activity than you can possibly imagine. I mean, I've worked them. I've worked quite a few, and in fact, I've worked 20 states, but there's not that many people active. Right then, let's talk about individual bands. On 6 meters, 4 meters, 2 meters and 70 centimeters, this is my, how can I put it? This is my, trying to think, classification, shall we say. They are basically Yagi basebands. A dish, unless it's particularly huge, is just not going to give you any gains on those frequencies, although some of the bigger dishes are certainly usable on 70 centimeters, but generally speaking, it's done with Yagis. And although 6 meters is used for EME, the antennas, as you appreciate, are huge. You cannot use a simple 3, 4, 5 element Yagi. You need to have monsters. And as you may be aware, when you talk about the gain of Yagis, it's actually not the number of elements that matter. It is the length of the boom. And so in order to get decent gain on 6 meters, you need very, very long Yagis, certainly a few wavelengths in length. And you probably need 2 or 4 of these things. So yes, there are stations active on 6 meters, but not many. As I said earlier, there's been 1 QSO made on 4 meters EME by GD0TEP. He worked at ZS6 back in the 2000s. You can go and have a look at it on his webpage. Of these bands, and probably overall, 2 meters is probably the most popular EME band. It certainly has been, and it probably remain that way. It's relatively cheap to get power. In fact, you can go and buy it off the shelf. Antennas are available or buildable. You can have a decent size antenna on, it's a long boom, but it's not as ridiculous as 6 meters. And it's very popular with some very good QSOs being made. There's only one problem with 2 meters, and that's noise. When I first got licensed and started operating on 2 meters of SSB back in 1980, 81, 2 meters was a very, very quiet band. There was very, very little interference on it. In fact, the biggest interference I got on 2 meters was from cars with bad spark plugs. Nowadays, I listen on 6 meters and it's absolutely full of noise from various computer-based systems. And that certainly was not a case in the 1980s. And of course, that impacts on EME as well. And so 6, 4, and 2, and that's true here, has got lots and lots of external noise. So if you live in a town or a village or a city, I think it's going to be problematic for you. 70 centimeters is a little bit better, a little bit quieter, although it's still not quiet as such, and certainly nothing compared to how it used to be. But 70 centimeters is a nice compromise. But as it says, antennas are massive in size in general. So let's have a look at some antennas. Oh, what we got here? That is a picture of I2FAK. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's got 16 Yagis and they're long, and they're also cross Yagis as well. It's not for circular polarization. It's just that on EME you get a thing called Faraday rotation, and sometimes signals will basically change their polarization, and being able to switch polarization is a big advantage. He is one of the big guns. Probably not the biggest, but very, very close. He probably runs a couple of kilowatts. And if you're going to hear anybody on 2 meters EME, it's going to be him. He is a very, very big station. He's also active on other EME bands, but his antennas are somewhat more sane on those. I've worked him on 23, and although he's got a decent antenna, it's nothing special. So that's I2FAK. Here's another one. This is 70 centimeters. This is DL7 APV. I was getting ready to try and work him last year, then unfortunately he died. However, his antennas have been dismantled and they will be reappearing somewhere else in Germany, I believe. I don't know how many Yagis, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there were 16 Yagis there. There were about 10 elements each, something like that, a few wavelengths long. That was his system, and he worked some amazing things with that, as you will see in a moment. That's DL7APV. Okay, that's a little bit more sane. This is MX0CNS. This is actually taken from their QRZ page, I think. And I'm not sure what antennas they are. Quagis, not entirely sure. Obviously set up for EME. It's definitely not the biggest system you'll see, but it's certainly sane. You can imagine that in your garden potentially. I don't know how successful they've been. I guess they must have worked a few stations at the very least. But as you can imagine, running 4 long Yagis is, especially on 70 centimeters, is something you can potentially do at home, provided you haven't got too many noise sources nearby. I don't have any information about the power they use or anything, I'm afraid. Okay, now from the sublime to the ridiculous. That is G3YEG. He's on the Isle of Wight, and this is from his QRZ page. I don't know the guy. I have seen him on 6 meters. That is his EME antenna. And yes, it is indoors. That's a 70 centimeters EME antenna. And he works EME, and he's worked a few stations off the moon. I would not recommend an indoor EME antenna, but the fact is this guy's done it, and power to his elbow. I'm very, very impressed. So the argument is, if he can do EME with an indoor Yagi, what's the smallest antenna you can use for 70 centimeters EME? Oh, let's have a look. There you go. That is also from MX0CNS in Essex. He has worked EME using that dipole and 60 watts, which is basically ICOM 9700 barefoot, I'd imagine. I've got one here. He has worked EME with that. He worked DL7APV with the 16 Yagis. Going back to that equation, you can see that if you reduce the antenna gain of one, providing the antenna gain of the other is large enough, it can make up for it. That is why he was able to use a dipole, and he was able to work, I think, actually 2 stations off the moon, maybe 3. He also worked HB9Q. So you look at that and go, wow, I did. So yes, you can work EME with a dipole. It will only work 1 or 2 of the very, very big guns, but believe me, they'll be very willing to try because, well, it's quite a nice thing to be able to boast, isn't it? You know, well, I can work people using a dipole. Whew, beat that. So let's talk about 23 and 13. This is where I'm on slightly surer ground. As it says, it's mostly dish-based, but Yagis are usable. One thing to bear in mind, and I'll come to this a bit further down, is that the standard on 23 and 13 is circular polarization. And Yagis, unless you phase them, don't do circular polarization. So you are immediately down by 3 decibels. Not to mention the fact that something like a 2.4 meter dish, oh, that's what I've got, has an awful lot more gain than a Yagi. But having said that, it's possible. And there are some very, very good stations out there using Yagis. It says here, minimum dish size is usually regarded as 2 meters in diameter. Except KB2SA, who normally runs a 1.9 meter dish, he was experimenting with a 1 meter dish a few months ago, and I worked him. He wasn't very strong, and I don't have a particularly big EME system, but I worked him. He was using a 1 meter dish. However, yet again, if you can put up something bigger, it is highly recommended. As it says, circular polarization is the standard, which makes life an awful lot easier in a great many ways. What is very, very nice is that essentially the noise, external noise, stuff that you possibly can't do anything about, is low. You can use very, very good preamplifiers. My preamplifier is 0.3 dB noise figure from WD5AGO. And there's almost no noise. You can, when your receive gets to a decent level like that, you can actually hear the noise from trees. If there's a tree in the way, because it's warm, it actually generates noise. You can actually hear it. And obviously you can hear other electronic devices, but it's not a big problem on 23. So it's a fairly quiet band. You will hear weak signals, and it works very, very well indeed. Typically, typically power is measured in the hundreds of watts. Certainly, if you want to be what you would call a normal EME station. But as you remember from the equation, if you've got a decent antenna at both ends and good receivers, then in fact you can turn the power down. I reckon, not tested by the way, that if I was to transmit 10 watts into my dish, I could probably still work a few stations. I'd hear a lot more, don't get me wrong, but I reckon I could work a few stations, although I've never tried it. Maybe one day I will. 13 sems is supposed to be the ideal EME band. I don't know why. Never operated it. But the only problem with 13 centimeters is that it's fragmented. We use 2320, America uses 2304, and Japan uses 2400. In fact, we used to be on 2304 as well, but we lost that part of the band back in the 1980s, I think it was. And that's why I went to 2320 and the rest of Europe followed us. But we all used to be on 2304 except for Japan. But with modern radios and modern hardware, that is less of an issue, but there is a lot of crossband or cross-frequency operation on that band. So you, for example, transmitting on 2320 and receiving on 2400 to Japan or 2304 to the States. Let's look at some dishes. Here we go. Here's somebody you'll come across in a bit. HB9Q. That is a 10-meter solid dish. That's 33 feet in old money. He is one of the big stations. Most people do not have dishes like that. But say he runs, on 23 sems, he runs about a kilowatt into that, and his signal is absolutely immense. Do you remember that guy who worked with a dipole on 70 centimeters? Well, he worked this station. HB9Q is actually a club call, but his name's Dan. That's the main operator, and he's always around and is always willing to try with very, very small stations. I'm sure he'd be willing to give you a try with a dummy load, probably. Oh, this is more like it. That is a 2.4 meter folding dish. You can buy folding dishes from called Subluna in the States. I think they're quite expensive, to be fair, but a lot of people use these. In fact, there's one station, I haven't included his picture, but he goes portable all over the world. He did last year, we did Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey. He did Mauritius in November. I didn't work him because my PA had blown up by then. He goes all over the world doing EME with one of these dishes. That is a picture of KB7Q in Montana. Although I got this picture off the internet, he actually sent me a QSL card with that picture on as well. So you can actually do EME portable, shall we say. Now, that's me. That's my dish in the back garden. And believe me, it dominates the garden a lot more than you appreciate. 2.4 meters. Unlike the other one, it isn't a folding dish. It's fixed. It's probably slightly better for it. It works rather well. I've worked some quite amazing stuff, and I amaze myself every time it's active. As you can also see, there's a big house behind it. And for that reason, my view of the moon is restricted compared to other people. I have to wait about 4 hours between the moon coming up and before it appearing. And the same goes for it disappearing behind our house, behind the photographer. However, I still get a good 6 or 7 hours operational time on the moon. It's definitely worthwhile. As you can see, there's a nice Ocado bag over the dish feed to keep it dry. And here is G0HIK. He is one of two stations I've worked off the moon who uses Yagis. I think they're 36 element Yagis. He's got a pair of them. He lives up in Cumbria. He's certainly not one of the strongest signals off the moon, but I've worked him a few times. And there's also OE3JPC. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any decent pictures. He's got longer Yagis, and his signal, considering, is amazing. Remember, they're losing at least 3 decibels compared to a circular polarization, regardless of the size of the dish. But they do remarkably well. So it's possible. Yeah, let's talk about the higher bands. Now, this is definitely not Yagi land. That is also true, by the way, of for terrestrial work as well. It's dishes, really. But obviously, generally speaking, the dishes are smaller than the lower frequency bands. They tend not to be made out of mesh, although they can be, but they tend to be not quite as good, tend to be solid dishes up there. For various technical reasons, they use linear polarization. Vertical for us, I think it's horizontal in the States. It all works out anyway. If you do the mechanics of the reflections off the moon, it's all calculated correctly. Like for 23 and 13, the sky and environmental noise is very low. So low noise figure preamps are usable. The only downside is the preamplifiers aren't quite as good as the ARC 23 and 13. I've got one here by a guy called DU3T. I think it's 0.7 dB noise figure, but that is state of the art. Powers also tend to be much less, as you can appreciate. Generating 300 watts on 10 gigahertz is almost impossible, for example, although on 9 and 6 maybe it's possible. Most people on for 3 centimeters tend to run 8, 9, 10 watts or more. There are some high power stations, but I'm hoping to get on to 10 gigs EME, and I'm looking to run about 30 watts, I think, something of that order anyway, eventually. And the best systems are waveguide based. However, you'll be able to do it with coax as well. When I say coax, we're talking semi-rigid here, SMA connectors. It's a different world. But having been on 10 gigahertz terrestrial since 1999, it's not beyond the means of normal people. It just sounds like when you look into it, it's just different. That's all. You certainly can't use RG58 and PL259s, that's for sure. Let's have a look at some dishes. Okay, that is a dish of an OARC member. That's G4HSK's dish. I think it's 1.2 meters in diameter. I don't know whether he's on the call, but if he is, he can fill us in. If not, it might be his 90 centimeter dish. But let's assume it's 1.2 meters. He runs, I think, 8 watts. You can look at his web pages to get some data. He's got some very good web pages. He explains how he put the system together, and he's very successful on EME. So that's 8 watts to a 1.2 meter dish on 10 gigahertz. We are not talking excessive systems here. Okay, this is another UK system. This is G4RFR. This is the Flight Refueling Club based near Poole. And this is their dish. It's a 3.7 meter solid dish. They're active on every EME band from 23 centimeters to 24 gigahertz, which they're getting active at the moment. They run about 150 watts on 23 centimeters. They put out a nice signal. They're a bit stronger than me because they've got a better dish, but my equipment's better on the whole. On 10 gigahertz, they're in the lucky position of having 200 watts, but that is exceptional. So most people run 30, 40 watts maybe. And they are incredible signals off the moon. I've been there. In fact, I was there last Sunday. I've been there when they've been doing echo testing, and their own echoes are so loud, it's unbelievable. They could probably work themselves on FM. We're talking that level of signal. It's absolutely phenomenal, but that is not normal. Most stations are not quite at that level. They are quite special. Oh, and this one, as it says, that's SA5IKN. He also has an M0 call sign. I think he studied over here. That is his 10 gigahertz system. Now, he's got 30 watts, which is very nice. That is a 90 centimeter dish. Nothing special. In the garden, I've got a 90 centimeter dish for QO100, which I could potentially use for EME, I suppose. But anyway, he's using a 90 centimeter dish and 30 watts. And recently, he worked a station in Italy who was running a not dissimilar system on his balcony and his house. This guy designed it such that he could work himself. So yeah, 90 centimeters, 30 watts, great. So if you've got a bigger dish, you do better based on the equation. So that's something that you look at something like this and you realize you don't have to put too much effort. Well, you do, but you don't have to put big amplifiers on. Almost all the equipment is actually hanging off the dish feed because obviously you want to keep all the losses as low as possible. And you'll find that the cables going up are going to be probably 2 meters IF or maybe 70 centimeters and 24 volts DC or something. I don't know. So what is the minimum to work EME? This is from HB9Q's webpage. Say they've got a very big station in Switzerland. So according to him, 50 megahertz, 1 Yagi, 500 watts. Well, I can't do that. Actually, I could, but I don't have a Yagi. 2 meters, 1 Yagi, and 50 watts. Now that is getting very possible. My ICOM 9700 here has got, I think, 80 watts output. So potentially if I threw up a Yagi, it would work. 70 sems, 1 Yagi and 25 watts. Well, I've got 75 watts on 70 sems, and I've got a long Yagi. Maybe I'll give it a go. 23 sems, 1 Yagi and 10 watts, or 1.5 meter dish and 5 watts. That's insane, isn't it? 13 sems, 1 Yagi, 20 watts, 1.5 meter dish and 10 watts. Bit more, but I'll tell you what, I've got 20 watts already for use on QO100. I wonder. 9 centimeters, 1.5 meter dish and 20 watts. I've got no power on that band. 6 centimeters, 1.5 meter dish and 10 watts. I've got 5 watts on that band. 3 centimeters, 0.6 meter dish and 10 watts. Wow. Well, I've already got a 9 centimeter dish and 8 watts, so I could work him. I really could. That'd be absolutely amazing, and perhaps I'll do that. So because essentially looking at that equation at the beginning, he's doing the hard work, but he's not alone. There are other stations out there with very, very similar antennas. There's one station, OE9ERC, runs a kilowatt to a 10-meter dish. His signal is absolutely phenomenal on 23 centimeters. Absolutely incredible. One of the loudest signals I've ever heard. I can actually hear him in the speaker very easily. So although if you want to be a big station, you've got to obviously put up a big dish and run power. But the reality is, if you want to work one of the big guns, and there are quite a few of them around, there's also NC1I, also a very big gun in the States. If you want to work one of these guys, you actually don't need much. You need equipment that works reasonably well. And obviously you've got to track the moon, which can be a bit of a pig as well. But if you're willing to put that effort in, you can start working people with not very much equipment. And so you'll get rewarded for your work. It's absolutely amazing. So conclusion. Okay, EME does require a certain amount of commitment. You're probably not going to put a system up together in a weekend. I started building my EME system, I think in March 24. I had my first QSO in November, although in reality, if I'd pulled my finger out, I probably could have done it maybe a month or two earlier, but it was most of the year anyway. You can work some of the very big guns with very small antennas and low power, 70 centimeters, 60 watts, and a dipole. Wow. Receive only EME operation is worthwhile. It definitely is, especially if you just want to see if your equipment's working. My next stage will be 10 gigahertz. I've got a dish feed in front of me. I've got a preamplifier in front of me. I've got a radio cable of 10 gigs. In theory, I could have receive working quite quickly. I'm not going to list them. There are a huge number of internet resources, web pages created by various people like KA1GT and various other people like that. EME chat is great. HB9Q is the place to go. Not for 2 meters, but for the other bands. HB9Q. It doesn't cost anything. You just register and you can chat with some very interesting people on there. EME mailing lists. I think there's 3 main ones, although it's a bit silly because everybody copies everything to all 3 mailing lists. And finally, you've got the 432 and above newsletter. I've actually got a web page address for you there, https eme.radio. It's a relatively new web page, but it collates a lot of information from other sources. And the 432 and above newsletter is highly, highly recommended. It's also good to get inspiration to see what other people are doing. It usually includes a lot of photographs of antennas and people describing what they do. Sometimes they just describe who they've worked. I've appeared in it a few times, and sometimes people say I've tried this but it didn't work. It's a great resource, and they've got newsletters going back at least 20 years, and you can see the development of it over the time. Very, very interesting and highly recommended. In fact, the whole web pages, they have links to other EME pages. So that is a skim over EME. There's a lot more to say. I could easily fill the talk and more just explaining how I put my own EME system together. As you may be aware, I do have a web page on OARC, which describes how I put my system together. And in due course, I'll be expanding that to describe how I do 3 centimeters when I get around to it. And you will find other web pages with people's descriptions for how they built their system. So if you really want an interesting challenge, I highly recommend you try EME. It's extraordinary. That's all I can say. It's to think that your signals have made it to the moon and back again is one of those experiences you don't forget in a hurry. And with that, I'll say this is the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was wonderful and very interesting. And oh, my camera does not work. There we go. I cannot believe the size of some of those antennas. That's absolutely insane. And I imagine that also has quite an effect as well on the cost. Um, I'll open up the floor to people if they want to ask questions. Um, there's enough of us on the call, I think, that you can probably just unmute yourself and go for it if you want to. And fire away if anybody wants to go first.
So,
Yeah, oh,
Chris here. One of the
Go ahead, Chris.
ridiculous things I say to people is that I want to do Moonbounce just so that I can hear myself and use the Doppler shift and the delay and the return signal to speed trap the moon. But then you said something there in the middle of that about he built a system, that one of your people built a system in order to hear himself. So is that a reasonable thing to want to do? And have you ever done it?
I can't, with my system, I can't hear myself. I can see the echoes on echo mode in WSJT, which works very well, by the way. But my own echoes were about minus 20 dBs in 3 kHz, which is well below audible, unfortunately. You do have to run a reasonably large system to hear your own echoes. So yeah, that's not something you're going to do without some commitment. If you got to that level, you're going to be working a lot of people. You'd be very popular.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Jason, I saw you unmuted yourself there. Do you want to fire away?
yeah, I did. Great talk, Jonathan. And I think
Yeah.
probably all of us were laughing away from the massive arrays to the attic antenna. That was absolutely brilliant. Absolutely. Could you say a little bit for Luddites like myself about what the noise figure of a preamplifier means? It's obviously not something you add to your system gain or remove or something. I've
No,
never fully got my head around that one.
it's a good one. That it's a big subject to know that. You can think of it as noise temperature. It's the equivalent noise generated by your preamplifier, which can be referenced to the temperature of a resistor. There's a direct equivalence between noise figure and noise temperature. Um, I'm a bit vague on that. Essentially, the general rule is the lower the number, the better. Essentially it's the degradation it adds, or if you want to call it add, but it's the degradation of the input signal.
Interesting.
And so basically, if you've got a 0 dB noise figure, which is impossible, then you're not degrading the input signal. You've got the raw signal, then it's going to be amplified and it's going to be degraded slightly.
So it's almost a sort of an equivalent, like it's a Boltzmann-esque noise,
Yes,
thermal, temperature type. Zero would
yes,
be 0 Kelvin, and there's
yeah,
some sort of scale. Okay, okay,
yeah.
cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so that adds noise. But say the nice thing about 23 sems and higher, you can use very low noise preamplifiers because the external. Actually, I say that, but actually, where I'm here, there's an awful lot of noise I get from Kinetic up on the hill. They test their radars every so often on their Type 45 destroyer, and that's a pain. Fills my band full of rubbish. I can still work through it. God knows what I do to their receiver. Um, but yeah, I do get them. But most of the time, I get nothing. But I do hear noise from trees. That's very bizarre.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jason. There's a question here from Jacob. How much noise is added to the signal during amplification, like SNR? So yeah, so that step,
Oh,
what does that do to the signal, and how do we control against that?
well, you can't control it. I mean, all you can do is use the best noise figure you can get. You've got the raw noise figure as the signal arrives, and after your preamplifier, it's obviously increased to a level that's usable, but it's also been degraded slightly. Now, how that is actually calculated, I'm afraid I'm not entirely sure. It is documented, that's for sure. It's not voodoo, but it's not something I've ever need to worry about. The general rule is just try and get as low a noise figure as possible. Yes, there is a crossover between radio astronomy and EME. It's not something I've ever done, to be honest. I'm too dyed-in-the-wool guy trying to work people. So, but there is a crossover because obviously once you've got a decent sized dish and a low noise preamplifier, you can certainly start hearing noise from the center of the galaxy and things like that.
Mm.
Absolutely.
I know a few people who do hydrogen line stuff as well.
Yes, I
So
believe that. Isn't that
yeah,
1421 megahertz or something? I forget now.
something like
No,
that.
yeah,
Yes.
I've come across it. It's not something I've ever done. I'm
Hmm.
not sure my dish is big enough. I'm sure I could probably receive something, but I mean, I
I
can hear the
believe that you don't
noise.
need quite a big dish, actually. I don't think you
No,
need that
maybe.
big a dish to do it because I have friends, and obviously as you know, do the weather satellite stuff on 1.7 gig, and it comes up regularly as something that can be done with the types of dishes that we use for that, which is usually something like 60, 80, 100 centimeter dishes. So my
Hmm.
understanding is that you don't need a huge dish for that. If anybody
Okay,
else
yeah.
here knows better, feel free to jump
The only
in.
thing I would say is I'd have to, change my dish feed and preamplify. And yeah, it's not something I want to go into. I'd rather get another band. I mean, I've got
Yeah.
quite a lot of the equipment for 13 centimeters. I've got a PA, all that
Mm.
needs building. Um, but I don't have a dish feed or preamp for 13, but I don't mind getting on 13. My existing dish will do that, or should do anyway.
Yeah.
Got Pro. There's a question. Higher bands,
Yes. From
weather
Nick.
has an effect. Less than you imagine. The band with the biggest effect is 24 gigahertz, because that's actually close to the water absorption frequency, and that's a problem for terrestrial operation as well. So 24 is certainly affected by what's the is it hydrometers, clouds basically, and rain. I think 47 gigahertz gets that to some extent, but I don't know because the highest frequency I've ever operated has been 3 centimeters. Now, I know that on 3 centimeter terrestrial operation there is rain scatter, which is a valid mode. I've used it myself. Worked quite a lot of DX on it as well. But there is rain scatter, so there is the potential that if you've got torrential rain in your path between you and the moon, that on 10 gigahertz it could potentially scatter your transmission and reception signals quite heavily, I'd imagine. But as such, no, certainly not on 23. Makes no difference whatsoever. My biggest concern is my gear getting wet, to be perfectly honest, not the actual weather.
Jonathan, I have a question. Obviously, we were talking about the lower frequency bands that this has been
Mm.
done on. Is there any work being done to try and push that further down, do you know? And is there a limit for this kind of thing,
I don't think it's limit.
hard or otherwise?
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure what practical antenna has a gain much below a dipole, to be honest. Um, Bear in mind, it's the other end that's doing the work. In this case, he was using like a 10-meter solid dish or something of that nature. Now, there is a station in the States who comes on in contests only. It's N0PRT, and they have a 30-meter dish. It's a proper radio astronomy dish. And when they come on with their 2 kilowatts, it is like, well, I won't describe. You will hear them probably on a dummy load or something pretty close to it. However, whether it hear you is another matter.
Wow. Two
Receives,
kilowatts into
yeah,
the
it's
dish.
or at least
Wow.
into the feeder going into the dish. And I'm sure it's probably a very impressive feeder. It's got 7/16 connectors on, so it gives you a clue. Um, Interesting question. I think the preamplifiers, without going to liquid nitrogen cooling, are probably more or less at the limit what they can do. So the only things you can tweak are antenna gains and transmit powers, but of course transmit is only one way anyway. I mean, even with 350 watts in the shack, there were still one or two stations I could only hear. I could never work because you know they had very high power and not very good reception, to be perfectly honest. Most of the people I could hear, I could work. To be fair, um, I don't know. You say you look at that equation. I mean, it's a very simplistic equation, but essentially, yeah, you reduce one, you've got to increase another to improve it, be it antenna gain or whatever. So I don't know, working 60 watts to a dipole, I suppose you could go down to 10 watts into a dipole, but that would make you more than 6 dBs weaker, and I might be just below it. I don't know. I must say, I never thought of doing that, to be honest.
Uh, do we have any other questions? Anybody who either wants to pop them in the chat or otherwise?
One thing I was thinking of doing, I had a M7, a local M7 came to visit me about a year ago, actually, and I was doing some EME, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice to put an M7, novice or whatever you call it, foundation license, put him on EME? Just imagine the kerfuffle he could write into Radcom. I worked EME, turn the power down to 10 watts, wouldn't have been a problem. He would have worked some stations, there's no doubt. Then I looked at the license regulations, and as an M7, you don't have 23 centimeters.
Yeah,
Otherwise, I would have let him loose on that. That would have been a lot of fun. Yeah,
that is a
it would have
shame.
been. It is,
I
yeah.
I assume is that because of its closeness to other
I,
things
I
or
have no idea. I suppose the implication is that it gives you gives you a reason to upgrade. I suppose I don't know, but I was a bit annoyed about that because I certainly would definitely have turned the PA down or even bypassed it and let him loose. That would have been I would have enjoyed that. I think he would as well, but. Yeah, because
yeah,
he would have been fresh meat, so everybody and his dog would jump on him.
they would
What I
have all
didn't say
wanted him.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, on my first night on EME, I worked 13 stations. My first week on EME, bear in mind I was running low power, relatively speaking, and the wrong dish feed for various reasons. I worked 65 unique stations off the moon. My
Wow,
first week,
that's insane.
it was. It's not what you expect. It was
Yeah.
extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I bet obviously with it being such a niche sort of field, as you say there, when somebody new pops up, everybody wants them. It's exactly the
Yes.
same, albeit in a very, very not quite as niche fashion on, the low Earth orbit satellites and that kind
Oh
of
yeah.
thing. As
Yeah.
soon
Yeah.
as people show up who haven't been heard before, it,
Yeah.
it can bring people out of the woodwork for CQs.
Absolutely. I've been there myself, because I used to operate satellites back in the day. And yeah, satellites are an awful lot of fun. I mean, I've got a Cure 100 system, which hasn't been used for a couple of years. But yeah,
Mm.
I was active on Oscar 10, Oscar 13, Oscar 8, RS satellites, all sorts. Yeah, back in the day.
Space is great. More people should do space radio. That's
Yes, agreed.
the
Yeah.
general takeaway from this.
It's the gateway drug to EME, I tell you.
Well, I don't know about that yet. Well, ask me in 10 years, we'll see.
Yeah.
Um, is there any other last questions? Well, any quick ones or anything at all before we sort of finish here this evening?
I'll certainly ask one more. Don't want to
Mm,
capitalise, but I'm so
No,
curious.
go ahead,
yeah, no
Jason.
problems.
We'll
Yeah,
Go for
it
it.
sounds like one of the big challenges, apart from all the other stuff, is actually tracking the blooming moon and building yourself slash using a tracking station.
Oh,
Without going and buying one of those highly expensive Yaesu thingies, is there anything that anyone's done out there to sort of home assemble something to make
yes.
that a little bit less expensive?
Well, it
Or
depends what you mean. I mean, my rotator is a thing called a SPID RAS, and they're expensive, but they're designed for that sort of gear. And they come with a nice controller with USB connection. There's a bit of software called PST Rotator, which costs, I think, $30, and that does it all for you. PST Rotator can do anything. It can be used for HF, Moonbounce, satellites. It's brilliant. I use that. I just set it up. I peek it up on the sun to start with to make sure it hasn't drifted, and then I just let it go and forget about it basically. However, it's not the cheap option. The problem is, um, people are now using slew drives from China, and they are superb. They can move houses practically as long as you can balance your house on it or move it. But they're not cheap either. But you get one of those, and you can go up from your 1 meter to a 10 meter dish, and you won't even notice. So people are doing it, but yeah, your standard rotators are not particularly good when it comes to 23 sems and higher. The beam width of my dish is about 3 degrees,
and
something like that.
you're fighting mechanical lash, right?
A bit. If it's one
Or is
degree, I'm not going to notice, to be honest. It's pretty good. It's the SPIDs are designed for EME, and they don't move around like the Yaesu ones. And I have had Yaesu rotators, and they're perfectly decent for most work. But for EME, for example, the flight refueling, they're down to zero point 0.1 degrees on their elevation and azimuth using home built gear,
nice.
and their backlash is less than 0.1 degree. But they did a lot of mechanical engineering on that because on 10 gigs, I think they're 0.2 degrees, zero point 0.3 degrees band beam width. It's insane, basically.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's a level I'm not never going to go there, but 1 degree is good enough for me.
Right, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jason. I think I did promise that we'd have a little buffer for people to get to pubs, so I'm going to call it there if that's okay. Um, One last appreciation, please, for Jonathan for a fantastic opening talk for our talk series. You can react as at will. We will do these every month, as I said, and it will be the first Saturday of the month, 7 till 8 before pub. And all of the events that we have booked so far are on the wiki. And I hope that tonight has put some ideas in people's head. It would be wonderful later in the year to see somebody has started buying stuff.
Well,
That
one
was what
thing
this whole series was about, was getting people into things.
Chris has just said, I need to move to a bigger garden. You should see the way this dish dominates this garden. You have to lean out the way to get down the garden. But yes, yes. Yeah.
Perfect.
And also, of course, as you know, I'm on OARC every day, more or less. So if anybody's got questions, you can grab me and, I'll be around. It's not,
Perfect. That's great, Jonathan. Thank you very much for your time and for presenting for us. And yeah, thank you all for watching or indeed coming. And we'll see you next month.